All right, so I'm going to talk about Karl Marx and the U.S. Civil War, and I'm going to talk about it in a particular way. As I was trying to figure out what I was going to say up here, I felt that maybe there were 7 or 8 different talks you could give called Karl Marx and the U.S. Civil War. But the thing that I have decided to focus my attention on is the question of race and racism. There's a critique of Marx that you find in, let's say, college courses, workshops here and there, that goes something like this. Marx is fantastic when it comes to understanding the economy, understanding capitalism, but he's bad on race. It's a blind spot for Marx. He's Eurocentric. Some say he falls into the same patterns of thought that the Enlightenment Eurocentric thinkers fell into, and though he's critiquing them, he's just like them. And that one way or another, Marx is not a reliable go-to person for a framework or understanding, a critique of racism. That in some way it's either a blind spot or where he does talk about it's inadequate. And the more you investigate the actual historical record, the funny thing about that is that Marx surprises you on that score, on that particular score again and again. Now, it's true he never wrote an extended theorization of race. There's no Marx on race pamphlet that you can read or a book that Marx wrote about racism or racism itself. What we have are fragments, which I understand methodologically is an inferior approach, perhaps. But I think that when you lay these fragments by each other, that what you end up with is more than just fragments. You end up with a view of racism in relation to capitalism as it's unfolding in Marx's day. And all of this comes out quite forcefully, I would argue, during the period of the U.S. Civil War, as I want to show. Now, Marx saw, of course, famously, that one of the central contradictions of capitalism was that alongside producing incredible, unheard of wealth, it also produced tremendous, previously unheard of suffering, and that those two things, Marx would argue, were two sides of the same coin. But he did also perceive that there were, in some cases, specific dimensions of that suffering that were very much directed at specific so-called races. In particular, Marx understood that the Africans kidnapped for plantation labor in the New World were playing a pivotal role in world history by what they were doing there. In fact, that word pivot is pivot. That word pivot is his word. Listen to what he says. Direct slavery, what's going on in the New World, is as much the pivot of our industrialism today as machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery, no cotton. Without cotton, no modern industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. The colonies have created world trade. World trade is the necessary condition of large-scale machine industry. Thus, before the traffic in Negroes began, the colonies supplied the old world with only very few products and did not visibly change the face of the earth. Slavery is therefore an economic category of the utmost importance. So rather than a kind of, Eurocentric view, it's the white workers and the textile factories that are at the center of what's happening in the world. No, it's not. The Africans are not in the periphery of what's happening. He's saying the Africans, enslaved in the New World, are the center of what's happening in all of world capitalism. And it's not a moral consideration that he puts them at the center, but a concrete material question of how the world is actually developing, how this thing, capitalism, is coming to be. As Marissa mentioned, there's a talk later on, Friday, on the role of black slaves in pushing forward their own emancipation during the Civil War. Now, mostly a lot of that history is hidden from us, the history of slave revolts, the history of what black people did to emancipate ourselves in the context of the Civil War. And a lot of analysis focuses on what white people were saying and doing, not what black people were saying and doing. And so it's interesting to notice, just with all of these charges floating around about Marx, he surprises you again and again. It's interesting in 1860 that he would write a letter to his collaborator Engels and say, in my opinion, the biggest things that are happening in the world today are the weavers in Silesia, the Chartist movement. No! The biggest things happening in the world today are, on the one hand, the movement of the slaves in America, started by the death of John Brown, and on the other, the movement of the serfs in Russia, naturally connected in his mind. I've just seen in the Tribune that there's been a fresh rising of slaves in Missouri, naturally suppressed, but the signal has now been given. So of all the things Marx could be focusing his attention on, the rising of slaves suppressed in a small town in Missouri, to him is the signal. That, you see, is the key. That Marx understands and recognizes, tuned in to the subjectivity of the slaves. Not just like, oh, the poor unfortunate slaves, victims of capitalism. No, agents of turning up the whole situation. They're moving in Missouri, in a little town in Missouri. What? Stop! The signal has been given. It flows, though, if you think about it dynamically. If what they're doing is pivotal, if it is the pivot for the whole world capitalist system, then what they might do to try to undo their circumstance would naturally also be the pivot of challenging the whole setup. It makes sense. Now, okay, but what about race itself? What about Marx as a theorist of race itself, of the concept of race? Again, there's no pamphlet, Marx on race. But Marx has this talent for compressing into a very small number of words a whole bunch of ideas. Here's a passage. Listen to this little fragment, which, by the nature of its tone, is actually easily misunderstood. What is a Negro slave? A man of the black race. The one explanation is as good as the other. Whoa. Sounds like Marx is making a quite racist claim there, that a Negro slave is a man of the black race. Again, tone matters, because in the next sentence he says, a Negro is a Negro. He only becomes a slave in certain relations. Oh, so in those first part, he's referring to the idea that's out there, that everybody thinks that a Negro slave is a man of the black race, and that one explanation is as good as the other. And then no, he changes the tone and says, no, actually, a Negro is a Negro. He only becomes a slave in certain relations. He goes on. A cotton spinning jenny is a machine for spinning cotton. It becomes capital only in certain relations. Torn from these relations, it is no more capital than gold in itself is money, or sugar, the price of sugar. So just like gold is not intrinsically money, just sitting there on the ground, only in certain relations does it become money, so too, Marx argues, a Negro is not intrinsically a slave. Only in certain relations does he arrive in that condition. That's pretty damn good. For the middle of the 19th century, this white guy never set foot in the US. He's not saying, oh, the poor victims, well, you know, they shouldn't vote, but we shouldn't enslave them, as some abolitionists thought. No, he's saying, in addition to all of the horrors of slavery, the racist things that you're saying about these people are not true. In fact, the whole concept that you have of race is historic and not intrinsic to those people that you're saying those things about. That is pretty darn good from this little fragment. He's ridiculing the idea. So while Marx understood in one moment that capitalism is essential to the development of world capitalism, the pivot. But that changes. And actually there becomes another moment where there grows to be a tension between the rising modern capitalist industrial states of the North and the plantation slavery that's going on in the southern states. And as this tension between them comes to a head, and as the relation between them is changing, I think Marx again puts his finger on what the struggle is all about. He says, the present struggle between South and North is nothing less than a struggle between two social systems, the system of slavery and the system of free labor. The struggle is broken out because the two systems can no longer, they did before, can no longer peacefully coexist on the North American continent. It can only be ended by the victory of one system or the other. Now, we know from our history text that the South, the southern states, formed their own thing. They seceded. Marx pointed out that they had the audacity to fight for the freedom of enslaving other people. And while the South openly said that, I mean, this is what this is about. the North did not come out and say, we're for abolition. They're fighting for slavery, we're fighting to end slavery. That was not their line at all. In fact, the line of the leading lights of the North, exemplified by the newly elected President Abraham Lincoln, was along the lines of, yes, slavery's wrong, sure, but it's also the law. And we have to uphold the law, and we're part of this country with these people, and we're going to work it out, and we're certainly not going to invade them or terrorize them or do anything like that. We're going to strike a bargain. Marx and Engels, though, supported the North from the beginning of hostilities. Not, certainly, because of all this waffling and wavering going on, but despite it. They write countless articles, journalistic-type articles, to explain to their readers in not just in like left-wing newspapers, but in mainstream newspapers, as much as they can get out. They write blistering critiques of the Union generals, of their idiocy, of their failures to prosecute the war in a proper way. They critique the politicians. They critique Lincoln. They take this stance because they recognize the fundamental issues at stake, which are at stake, despite the attitudes of the Northern leadership. The question of who's going to control the United States. Is it going to be the slave owners who control the entire United States? Marx writes, the whole movement was and is based, as one sees, on the slave question, not in the sense of whether the slaves in the existing slave states should be emancipated or not, but whether 20 million free men of the North should subordinate themselves any longer to an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders. It's interesting to note there that Marx pits the whole population of the North against the slaveholders only of the South, not the whole population of the South. In fact, he writes quite at length about a kind of state-by-state analysis of the Confederacy and tries to show the dissension and conflict going on and how, again and again, it's the slave owners, that tiny minority of Southern whites who own the vast majority of the slaves, who strong-arm the policy of secession and push it through. 300,000 families out of about 7.5 million Southern whites. Now, Marx is living in London during this time. Marx is in England. And the British ruling class, whose views are represented in The Economist magazine, then and now, are immediately on the side of the South, upon whom their livelihood depends. I mean, where did their docks come from? Where did their textile factories come from? Where did their shipbuilding come from? Where did their banks come from? Where did their insurance companies come from? Where did any of it come from, if not from cotton? And from working up that cotton from those plantations on their shores. So the British ruling class knows which side of their bread is buttered, so to speak, and they immediately begin campaigning to intervene on the side of the South in the Civil War. And the Economist, there's all kinds of interesting back and forth where he takes apart their arguments. They're terrified of the prospect of a slave revolution. They're worried that it will come to that. And they're like, oh, trying to scare their audience with the prospect of, can you imagine a slave revolution? Marx is like, right, exactly, a slave revolution. Yes, right, exactly, yes. Nothing will scare the crackers like a slave revolution. That's not a quote. No. It's funny because I have the actual quote here. It doesn't do it for me. Marx says, one single Negro regiment would have a remarkable effect on Southern nerves. A remarkable effect. It would scare the crackers. It's okay, it's translation. I gotta bring it up to date. Marx regularly would remind his readers that this whole thing was initiated by the South. This is their doing. And that actually, he argued, this was not a defensive war just for them to hold on to what they got. But this is actually, he argued, an expansionary war. This is them trying to take over the whole of the United States. And he argued that they had to do that. They were compelled towards that policy for three reasons. One is a reason, he argues, that slave plantation agriculture tends to exhaust the soil and therefore continually needs new soil and therefore new territories in which to plant. And therefore must expand. He argued that as new states were being added, this is the era of westward expansion, as new states are being added to the Union, the whole question of, well, will that new state, just minted, be slave or free, threatens to challenge the equilibrium, if you have it, in the Senate, in the Congress. Will those representatives be slave-owning representatives, or will they be free representatives? And so their power, their national power, is being threatened. And lastly, that expansion for the Southern ruling class was an essential kind of social safety valve. that there's a danger with so many whites not owning the majority of slaves or any slaves at all. They're always a kind of social dynamite and a potential for them to turn their economic frustrations against the slave owners. And so the expansion gives them the opportunity to dream big, to have a possibility that they too will arrive in the same condition. They can go conquer that territory and set up shop for themselves. After going through all of this about the expansionary aims of the Confederacy, Marx says the Union would thus not in fact be dissolved, but rather reorganized. A reorganization on the basis of slavery, under the acknowledged control of the slave-holding oligarchy. The plan for such a reorganization was openly proclaimed by the leading Southern spokesman at the Montgomery Congress and accounts for the article of the new Constitution, which leaves open the possibility of each state of the old Union joining the new Confederacy. The slave system would thus infect the whole Union. Well, wait a minute, are they going to have plantations in Massachusetts? I mean, what are we really talking about here? In the northern states, he says, where Negro slavery is in practice inoperable, the whole working class would be gradually reduced to the level of helotry, to mere slavery. This would be in full accord with this is Marx, this would be in full accord with the loudly proclaimed principle that only certain races are capable of freedom. And as in the South, actual labor is the lot of Negroes, so in the North it is the lot of the Germans, the Irish, and their direct descendants. It's just very interesting to note here that Marx counts among the dangers of a Confederate reorganization of the entire United States, that the country would be reorganized along a racist principle, and that would become the guiding principle for all laboring people. Now look, I know there's a debate going on about all of these things. There's a debate about the Civil War, about the American Revolution. Many of the combatants are here in the room, so far sitting next to each other quite peacefully, you know. I understand that. There was a really great, I just acknowledge that to say that I'm not really addressing that here, and I just want to acknowledge that. There's a really great exchange in the journal Historical Materialism back and forth that I think is very much worth reading and that I learned a lot from. For what it's worth, I do want to say one thing, which is that I tend to agree with the idea that it's useful to view the Civil War through the lens of what you might call bourgeois revolution, where, and I understand Neil Davidson and others have done an important job of interrogating the concept of bourgeois revolution, and that it needs to be separated from the concept of any kind of a struggle for democratic rights, because we see again and again what's so common about bourgeois revolutions is that at their core, they seem to be about setting up the political and economic conditions necessary for the accumulation of capital, not setting up democratic rights. Wherever you see a struggle for democratic rights, it's because working and laboring classes have pushed that forward. And on occasion, they have raised that banner themselves, the bourgeoisie, as they need to, and as they don't need to, they just abandon it just as fast. And isn't that the pattern of the Civil War? That they don't want, that the northern industrialists, the progressive northern industrialists don't want a slave revolution. They don't want a total upending of the social order and the expansion of democratic rights to the Africans, slave laborers, and they try to avoid that at all costs. There's a general, Fremont, who starts, escaped slaves are running over into his camps. So he's like, whoa, brilliant. They know the area, they know the slave owners, they know what's going on, they can tell us these things, they can work as spies, they can work for us, we'll hire them. He was fired. It just makes so much sense, but they were so afraid of that policy that they tried to avoid it at all costs, and the concept of bourgeois revolution, I think, helps you to grasp that. But then once they had to do it, there's a logic to it. Engels and Marx begin to have a little debate where Engels is pointing to all the failures, all the stupidities, and he writes a letter to Marx that says, look, it's just stupidity after stupidity. Marx says, the opening line is hilarious of his letter, I do not altogether share your views. That's another one that might need some translation, no. Cool, maybe you have a better translation. But basically he goes on to say you're missing, you're so focused on the military side of things, you're missing the political side of things. He says, about the way that Lincoln tries to pacify the loyal slaveholders. He says he errs only if he imagines that the loyal slaveholders are to be moved by benevolent speeches and rational arguments. They will yield only to force. So far we have only witnessed the first act of the Civil War, the constitutional waging of war. The second act, the revolutionary waging of war, is at hand. Salute. And it turned out that that Marx was right about that the revolutionary raging of the war was at hand. It turned into a revolutionary war. And perhaps one of the themes that you might want to carry with you through this conference, besides this interesting stuff about Marx and racism and the Civil War, is a kind of general point, especially if you're new to this conference or to our politics, is one of the things you'll discover us talking about a lot is how in these revolutionary moments, in moments of great social change, that people's ideas tend to change dramatically. The thing that we all hit our heads up against a lot, how do you change people's ideas? How do you change people's ideas? It's in these moments, these special windows in history, where that kind of a transformation gets accomplished on a mass scale in ways that seemed impossible sometimes only a few months or weeks earlier. So here you have, and what's interesting to me about the Civil War is how that happens to the slaves, certainly, winning their own freedom at gunpoint. I mean, just a tremendous, that'll give you confidence, there's no doubt. You're gonna feel good about yourself when that thing's over. How do you feel? I feel good, Feel really good. We won. You can just imagine. It also infects the white soldiers who fight alongside them, who maybe were racist before, or maybe still were after, but their views underwent a transformation. There's a whole book of their letters home, like, gosh, Mom, we used to beat up abolitionists back home. Now I am an abolitionist, and everybody I know is too. It's amazing. Lincoln, there's a book Robin Blackburn just put out called An Unfinished Revolution, where he kind of talks about this moment in time where this transformation of American politics and of somebody like Lincoln ends up coinciding politically, at least for a brief moment, with the radicals and with politics of people like Marx. And in here, there's some nice original documents in the second half of the book, including Lincoln's first inaugural address and his second. And I wish I had time to read you both of them, but I'll just give you the gist of the first and then read you some for the second. In the first, he's like, yes, I'm president, and by the way, we're not going to invade the South. We're not going to invade the South. We have no hostilities with the South. We understand that slavery might be bad, but it's the law, and we're going to follow the law. And did I mention we're not going to invade the South? We are not going to invade the South. A few years later, his second inauguration, his tone is a little different. And I know there's a lot of debate about Lincoln, too. We could probably have a whole conference just about Lincoln, but listen to this. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Okay. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now, you can't tell me that dude didn't change. Come on. So, which is not to say, so yes, the Civil War required and involved a dramatic change in ideas, but that's not to say that it was all good and the racial issue was solved. In fact, immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, there were riots. There was a huge riot in New York City, a racial riot in which white mobs went around murdering blacks. There was a draft riot. Resentful whites, mainly Irish, resenting having been drafted into this war, blamed the blacks and went around murdering them. Now, so then the question arises, well, what about Marx? What did Marx have to say to that? Was Marx blind to this kind of thing and to the persistence of racism among working class whites in whose interest perhaps it was not being fostered? He was not blind. In fact, I would argue that he offered an explanation of that racism that was rooted in the social circumstances of the North. He said, and I quote, "The Irishman sees the Negro as a dangerous competitor. The efficient farmers of Indiana and Ohio hate the Negro almost as much as the slaveholder. He is a symbol for them of slavery and the humiliation of the working class. And the Democratic press threatens them daily with a flooding of their territories by niggers." Now, we know in hindsight that after the Civil War, that the racial order erected by slavery was smashed and a new one was reinstated eventually through a whole struggle against Reconstruction I don't have time to talk about, but a new institutional racism arose. And that we know that racism was so useful to the planters in justifying slavery, it also ended up having another use later on. It was useful to the rising capitalists who won the Civil War and reorganized the country in their image. It was useful to them as a way to divide workers from each other. And if you also take a few lines from the Communist Manifesto, in which Marx talks about how the unity of workers being brought together in these unified circumstances, but that unity is constantly being upset again and again by being pitted in competition with each other over the material conditions of their life. Who will get the job? Who will get the apartment? All this kind of thing. So there's a material basis for the competition between workers that can spill over and become part of racial antagonism between them that benefits the ruling class. Now, we should mention that having that kind of an analysis of racism is different. I really want to stress this. Having that kind of rough sketch analysis of the social purpose of racism is different from understanding the experience of racism. Marx never set foot in the US. He was a German Jew who had a comfortable upbringing, got a doctorate in philosophy. Frederick Douglass was born a slave on a plantation, escaped, taught himself to read and write. What's so interesting about these two people is that despite their profoundly different experiences of racism, when it comes to the political question of what is racism and what is its role and function in society, the argument of the one could be the words of the other. In words that could have been written by Karl Marx, Frederick Douglass says, "The hostility between the whites and blacks of the South is easily explained. It has its root and sap in the relation of slavery and was incited on both sides, the poor whites and the blacks, by putting enmity between them. They divided both to conquer each," says the man who grew up under the lash. After the slaves became free and the Civil War was over, Marx went on to had said more about racism, not just about slavery, racial slavery, but about racism in the New World that was developing after slavery. He compared it to the prejudices between the English and Irish in Britain. He said, "Every industrial and commercial center in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation, so turns himself into a tool of the aristocrats and capitalists of his country against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude toward him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes of the former slave states of the USA." And to the charge that some throw out, that Marx did not account for skin color in his formulation of capitalism, we need only to open Marx's book titled Capital and turn to the part where he talks about skin color. He says, "In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed, so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin where in the black it is branded." Again, a bunch of ideas in a tiny space. It's not that the white workers are going to liberate the blacks. You see, black people, just wait. The white workers are coming. And they're going to raise a mighty movement that will free you, you see. Just I know you have a problem with racism. Just hold on. No! It's the opposite. The white workers are paralyzed. They're absolutely paralyzed. They can do nothing because of the condition that the black workers are in and because of the whole racial prejudice situation. So that must be dealt with if this thing is ever going to get off the ground. In fact, there's a book called Marx at the Margins, where Kevin Anderson, I believe, where he begins to go through some of these different arguments about different periods of time, and he makes an argument about the question of the Irish and the English, and shows how in earlier periods Marx and Engels thought, well, yes, the Irish are an oppressed colony, it's the English workers that will free them. And then they start to dig into it, and for these reasons say, no, actually it's the other way around. English workers will never get out of that they're in as long as Ireland is oppressed. That labor in white skin can never be free as long as in black it's branded. That race, rather than being a secondary consideration or something put off till later, it's essential, it's central, it's now, it's the thing, the key thing, the pivot that must be turned in order to unlock the whole thing. How much time do I have left? Oh, great. Okay. So let me just sum up a little bit what I've tried to argue to this point. That, okay, we can just be done with the argument that Marx had nothing to say about racism, blind spot, Eurocentric, let's just be done with that. Second thing, if only. Second thing is that I think we should recognize that Marx was right on in saying that race and racism is a historical thing, not an eternal, intrinsic thing about a person, that race itself is an historical concept. Third, that we should recognize that Marx was tuned into the activity of slaves themselves, their self-emancipation, their own subjectivity, and that Marx perceived that racial prejudice served the interests of certain classes and not others, crucially, which I think is very useful for us today. And lastly, or maybe not lastly, but fourthly or fifth, I lost count, that Marx perceived the centrality of this question to the American context, to the country we're living in here. Which just leaves one last point that I want to make. And I just want to sketch it in the little few minutes that I have remaining. And that is just that Marx did not just write and theorize and this sort of thing. He also acted. He was an activist. And to his credit, Marx and his collaborator Engels were active in a movement that was in solidarity with the slaves and with the Union forces of the North, where he was in England. He was one of the leading figures of what was a mass movement in England to prevent Britain from intervening on the side of the South, for reasons we've already discussed. A movement that we should say was successful in keeping Britain out of the war. W.E.B. Du Bois and others have written about this, about these mass meetings in London where the labor leaders are speaking and Chartists are speaking, and Marx is up there addressing the crowds, talking about the importance of the struggle against slavery and rallying people in solidarity with that cause, which is even more amazing when you think about how many people in those audiences' jobs probably depended upon the export of cotton to the textile industry. And actually it was this anti-intervention, anti-war, well, not anti-war, because they were for the war, anti-intervention activism that helped to bring about what we know today as the First International, called the International Working Men's Association. And it's on behalf of the International Working Men's Association that Marx actually drafted a letter to Lincoln, congratulating him on his re-election. Lincoln's secretary drafted a very warm reply. It's like, wow, these two exchanged letters. Not in an informal, Abe kind of way. Abe, man, you've changed. So bourgeois. But in a mediated way, and briefly and very officially. But again, something that's in the Robin Blackburn book is the actual the back and forth, just the one and the one. But it's fascinating. And here again, you see Marx compressing a whole lot of ideas into just this very brief letter. He actually says it was much harder than writing a book, just to write this one letter to Lincoln. I can't read you the whole thing, but I will give you a little bit. To Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America. Sir, we congratulate the American people upon your re-election by a large majority. Not you, but the American people. We congratulate the American people upon your re-election. And then he gets right to it, no wasting time. If resistance to the slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery. Hint, hint. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, let me read you this part. While the working men, the true political power of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro, mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it, the whites, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. The language is a little funny, but he's basically saying while all of that was going on, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of civil war. The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come, that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world. I mean, wow, that's a perspective for radicals in the middle of a bourgeois revolution. This thing is an enormous barrier to progress. It must be swept away. Here we go into the Red Sea of civil war. And what's further amazing about this moment in time is that there were activists here in the United States, communists, imbued with that very perspective. Marx and Engels, there's a whole wave of people who come from Germany, refugees from the mid-century revolutions, who had some experience in these struggles for democratic rights. Some of them were communists, and some of those communists were personal friends of Marx and Engels, like in correspondence with them during the Civil War. And it's amazing the way that these German-speaking activists were also staunch anti-racists. One of them, August Willich, led a multiracial torch-lit procession through the streets of Cincinnati when John Brown died. And at the end of it, they fired off guns, and blacks and Germans, speaking in German, gave speeches against the Democratic Party and against slavery and racism. They had communist clubs all over America, but they disbanded them when the war began. I mean, these people had their priorities straight. And they rushed into the Union Army. And because of their clarity, because of their confidence and their courage, they tended to rise in the ranks of the Union Army. Some of them became officers, communists in the American military. And at least one of them, August Willich, just mentioned, became a general. The first and only communist ever to become a general in the US military. He had the respect and affection of the common soldiers under him because he shared their privations and was always in the lead when the fighting was thickest and treated them like men, not dogs. On returning to camp, he would put his troops at ease, address them as citizens, and proceed to lecture on socialism. Thank you.